So if I look at this particular learning outcome today that we are looking at covering is a bit more theoretical, and I think it's going to be a bit more interesting because it is probably the easiest learning outcome that we'll cover in this unit. So let me put it this way. There are loads of things that you'll be able to correlate to when we bring and discuss some of these using the slides. And I hope, keeping in mind the session that we are looking at doing, should not exceed more than 35-40 minutes today. Before I get into this, let's look at doing a bit of a quick recap in terms of what we've covered so far. So in terms of when we look at the learning outcome 1 that we covered, we basically looked at some key terminologies, looking at starting this particular unit with some key definitions of what is operation, what is design, what is logistics, what is supply chain management. We looked at some of the important things in the concept of how warehouses are set up. Do you recall any of that in terms of how location, designing, and planning of a warehouse is done? What are the factors which actually influence the designing of the warehouse or the layout of the warehouse, so that both the operations, there are loads of operations within this, but when we look at storage, delivery, docking, we look at servicing, supply chain, and the sorting side of things happening, which is what we call logistics and supply chain, would all work within the warehouse. And we looked at some examples of how these some of the factories which were set up after the World War II era, say example of Toyota, we looked at they set up the first plant in the US to service local demand from the market, and the reason why they had done it was primarily because the shipping, logistics side of things, in terms of transportation side of things, was adding a lot of cost when they were building cars in Japan and then shipping them over to the North Americas in particular for sales. So that was one of the reasons that we looked at. Also looked at some of the aspects of how some of this, when we plan a warehouse, we look at the problems which are encountered in terms of the planning has not been done correct. It can affect costs in terms of finances. Sometimes it can affect quality, and sometimes the whole operation cannot be set up to be time efficient because of the fact that the designing and the layout of the warehouse has not been done correctly. So picking takes, say, for example, a lot of time. Reloading or bringing inventory back into restock and raise the inventory levels takes a lot of time. And retrieval and storage, if it's not planned properly, then it can lead to time delays, and that could be one of the reasons why sometimes when we see large companies setting up warehouses, they put a lot of planning into it to ensure that the layout of the warehouse is such which brings out time efficiencies. So at Amazon's warehouse, for example, when they look at from ordering to picking up products, it should not take more than 45 seconds for the product to be picked up by a person when they receive it, or when they receive an order. That is how they plan it. So in order to build time efficiencies, conveyor belts, automated use of robots, technology is done, barcoding, RFID, things like that, which allow picking up products to be done quickly. Now, in the second learning outcome, we looked at some of the key bits of, systems which have over the years, they have come in as methodologies or, as systems which originally originated from, production and manufacturing facilities. So we looked at things like lean manufacturing. We looked at just-in-time. We also looked at the concept of, cell production and the different types of cell production which can be done depending on, whether the finished product requires team management, working in teams or working in isolation, how the workbenches need to be, organized and things like that. And then we took up some examples, though we didn't take them up in the presentation, but, on Moodle, put in some examples or case studies which primarily focus on understanding cell production or cell manufacturing in particular. What are the characteristics of that, and how it can be applied in a particular field. We looked at the history of lean mean manufacturing, why it was introduced, how it became a concept, and then a lot of work which was done primarily by the Japanese to introduce Kaizen, total quality management, continuous improvement, all these concepts that we see around, improving quality were integrated into the concept of lean manufacturing. And then Edward Deming's work primarily, which is the Denon cycle, is something which allows reduction of defects to happen and continuous improvement in terms of qualities process could be done. And then last but not the least, in the last presentation, we also looked at, one or two videos which primarily gave you some ideas about, how this actually works within a particular factory or a warehouse or a setup with a company. Now, in today's learning outcome, what we want to do is expand on some of the things of our understanding that now we know why warehouses are required, why local distribution is arranged, why a lot of companies start to focus on supply chain management in particular, or working on their supply chains because their operations become big. So we have a lot of background on that. The second part that we want to look at would be to understand, once they have understood where the warehouse needs to be done, what is the location they want to look at, how would this service demand, whether they would depend on private providers, whether they would look at redistribution centers. So when we look at all those things, we want to get into the third learning outcome here and understand the various concepts of warehouse and logistics. So when we look at various concepts, what we want to be able to look at is the types of warehouses which can be set up, what kind of operations are involved in that. We will look at the elements of different types of things which can be integrated into logistics. So what I want to do is, rather than start the presentation and the discussion today from slide 1, I'm going to go into something and show you two particular slides, which will give us a bit of a bearing on how this function has actually evolved over the years. So if I look at, this particular slide, which is slide 30 towards the end, it gives us a bit of a background and an overview of how the evolution of logistics and warehousing has started or has happened over the years, over the decades, I would put it this way. So when you look at the 1960s, when mass-scale production manufacturing started and industrializations began to happen in developing countries, lots of things were being produced, washing machines, fridges, we look at microwaves, those kind of things. When they started to go in a particular organization, if you look at wearing a hat right now as that you're working within a manufacturing facility, and with that you try and visualize that what were the different types of functions which the human resources were required to do. So in the 1960s, you would see that there was somebody working within a large setup. Let's look at an example of Nestle or Unilever, just as an example, and imagine that you were working within that company in the 1960s. There was somebody who was looking at manufacturing forecasting, who was basically looking at managing forecasting as a process. There were a number of people working within the sourcing and purchasing department. So you see buyers, purchasing managers, or people who were looking at placing orders with suppliers. There were different types of people working within different functions. There were people working in production planning and control, PPC as we call it. There were people working in managing inventory within a setup. There were people having different roles and working within warehousing, materials handling, packaging. So all these were individual functions in the 1960s. But when we look at, as the time progressed in the 1980s, we saw this consolidated into two broad functions. So if you were looking at working within this particular field, within manufacturing or production side of things, there were two kind of job roles that you could come across broadly, and they wanted you to have experience of all the things which were mentioned in the 60s. So it was called materials management, and if you were working towards the outward movement of goods and delivery to the customers, then you were involved in the physical distribution side of things. So there were two or three different kind of roles over the years which evolved when consolidation took place. So people had a lot of background and they worked within departments called material management. And in materials management, there were broadly three different types of functions, things like warehousing, material handling, and packaging. And physical distribution meant that people who took the products out from the warehouses, from the factories onwards to the customer. So that saw a bit of an evolution of the logistics side of things coming across in the early 1990s. So this function got further consolidated in the 1990s, and it was more or less termed as logistics. So if people were working within production facilities, manufacturing facilities, and they were more involved in the side of things to do with getting hold of, from the time the material was coming in to the time the material was being shipped out from the factory, in short, inputs becoming outputs by some processing happening within the factory, they were all termed in as, people working within logistics. Now, after the 1990s, you see a bit more consolidation and value addition happening. That some part of this, as companies became global, operations became global, we were introduced to the term of LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which started to happen in most countries in all types of economies. The concept of supply chain management started to come in because companies were procuring raw material goods from different countries. They were being manufactured in different facilities and then being shipped all over the world, as per the demands of the customer. So here, if you visualize an example of Dell Computers, when it became, kind of a household name in the early, 2000, you generally see that on a website you could go in, you can place an order, configure your PC, and the PC could have been delivered to you in about 5 to 7 working days, directly from factory in China to a location where you placed the order from, say, for example, in India, Pakistan, US, anywhere in the world. So that kind of a model meant that supply chain management as a concept came in because Dell was not manufacturing everything. They were buying processors from Intel, RAM from Samsung, motherboards from Asus. You look at cabinets, a lot of things coming in, but this meant that in the factory, when it was being assembled, there was a need to have some sort of a coordinated effort to maintain, inventory coming in, being produced as per the orders, and then being shipped out to customers. And that was the concept of literally or rudimentary, the concept of supply chain management. So here, lots of chains, that means partners and suppliers who were providing these goods to Dell were being maintained under this concept of chain management because at some stage, somebody in Dell would have managed all these suppliers or maybe one part of the supply chain, and they would have ensured that these material inventories made available at a time, and that would mean that they would have given some forecast, some sort of a planning would have gone in to create that forecasting, and that allows the customers to get the orders in the time frame they advertise. And after 2010, we look at a lot of consolidation happening, but that consolidation and this concept has now become logistics and supply chain management. And there's a lot of automation going in because of technology, use of robotics, use of technologies, which are going to be, my next slide. And those are, say, Internet of Things, as we call it, IoT. So we look at different types of technology being used within this field. But when I say different types of technology, I can generically say, which I mean is that the use of robotics. That means when we discuss car manufacturing facilities, the welding side of the process, which happens when the chassis are integrated together from sheets of metal, they require use of robotics. But there is a use of robotics now happening at every step of the way when the car is being manufactured. So from installing the heavy machinery, the tires, the engines, the integration, everything is brought in, transported by, robots. So that is one side of technology. But when we look at other side of things being used within logistics and supply chain, we call a concept called Internet of Things or IoT. And there are 4 or 5 broad types that we can cover. So one is item level tracking or telematics. The third is, asset management in this case. So how you can track, basically look at movement of material happening for each and individual products within the factory floor or within the warehouse or within the distribution when it is in the last mile. And then last but not the least, operational logistics, which would mean that you're using machinery, equipment to basically make operations quicker and faster. So when we look at this particular learning outcome, what we want to essentially understand in this would be to understand how technology has been brought in, how this field, which started off with the different functions within a manufacturing or a production facility, which looked at demand forecasting being done by somebody, to customer services being provided by somebody, how this over the decades has got consolidated into something called logistics and supply chain management. So this slide gives you a good prospect and an overview of how this particular field has evolved in the last 4 decades. And then when we look at this slide in particular, it talks about the integration of technology and how technology is enabling what is called more efficient logistics, more cost efficient logistics. That means this is one side of costing which every production manufacturing facility has to keep in mind, because when the product is to be shipped either from the factory to the intermediaries, to distribution centers, to warehouse, and from then onwards to customer, it requires, it is a cost, and this cost, can be minimized. It can help bring in some efficiencies or increase productivity with the use of technology within this sector. So what we're going to do now is basically look at understanding some of the broader concepts that we want to study in this particular learning outcome, and we will get on with some of this. So is that okay so far?
Yes.
Okay. So let's look at understanding some of the concepts of how warehousing has come about. Now we've looked at broadly the concept of warehousing. So if I have to look at a brief definition of what is warehousing, we will say that there is a series of activities which is done in order to organize and control things within a warehouse, and these would be done with the use of human resources, equipment and machinery, and the use of technology. And the idea there is, because when you work within a large warehouse, when you store a lot of inventory, you service a lot of orders, what you want to be able to do is organize the storage of inventory in such a way that it allows you to retrieve and stock and then service the customer orders in the most optimal way. That means in the most cost efficient way. Cost could be related to time. If I have to pick up an order and then ship it and put it onto the conveyor belt, it goes to the people who basically look at delivering it to the customer from time of the order being picked to the time the order is being shipped. If there is a lot of time, sometimes you would see that if you've ordered something online, you would cancel the order because the delivery has taken too long and you've sourced an alternative way of getting that product. So it involves time at every step of the way, and we'll look at one or two videos which will explain that, and the use of technology and robotics and equipment which has come in, which is helping kind of reduce the time the material actually spends within the warehouse. Now, if we have to apply the concept of management is made up of a word called manage. So if you look at management, the idea is somebody at this, within the facility is going to be responsible for looking at, ensuring that these series of activities happen as described in the process or in the policies. So when we look at the purpose of warehouse management is to primarily look at managing the inventory and the movement of inventory within the warehouse. And this could be to ensure, a series of activities are happening on time. So it could be shipping, receiving, picking, packing. Now, this particular term is very synonymous with somebody who works within a warehouse. So what you do on a day in, day out basis, if you work within a warehouse, you will primarily, at some stage come up with some of these terms that I'm looking at picking a lot of products, I'm looking at packing a lot of products, I'm looking at receiving a lot of orders or parcels which are coming in, from customers. If you are, when we look at, manufacturing and production facilities, we think of people who are, these facilities are actually producing goods. But when we think of, companies like DHL, UPS, some of the other big logistics companies, we think of, if you visualize, you will think of that you're receiving a lot of things. You're receiving a lot of things coming into the local distribution center or your store, basically your warehouse, from where they are sorted. And again, they go onwards to their journey to which, where they have to be, say, serviced or they have to be supplied, delivered to a customer. Now, if you look at some of the major functions which are involved in warehousing, these are all around these 4 or 5 basic activities: shipping, receiving, picking, and packing. So when we look at transportation would be something wherein you're looking at either the material coming into the warehouse, or it is the last mile wherein the customer is getting the delivery of the product from the courier. When you look at product mix, there are lots of different types of products being stored in the warehouse, and that is where we will talk about the different types of warehouses in the subsequent slide. Docking is, there are lots of bays, and I've got a video which I will show you, which basically talks about how and why is it important within warehouse to have docking bays so that material and inventory can be brought in, and material and inventory can be loaded onto trucks and it can go out. And this was something which was synonymous with the just-in-time system when Japanese factories created docking bays within production facilities, so material could be brought just in time, and there were designated docks wherein this material could be offloaded, reloaded, or taken straight away to the production line. Servicing side of things, and then protection against contingencies. So when we look at if something goes wrong within a warehouse, if we look at something not being found, how do we look at those contingencies is what we will also discuss in going further. Now, broadly, there are 2 types of warehousing requirements which we generally see. Now, there are warehouses which are put up by private providers. That means they would primarily, like, you buy a house and you rent it to somebody. Similarly, you will have somebody who will have a private and a public warehouse. So public warehouse spaces would be spaces which can be leased if you have a demand, or you want to basically look at building your capacity. Like in the Christmas period here, a lot of companies look at picking up spaces which are called public warehouses. That means they can essentially get it on a short-term lease to store products, inventory, or create local distribution centers, redistribution centers, in order to ensure that the delivery of the product happens on time. Private warehouses are operated by large companies which are in the business of logistics and supply chain, but it could also be large facilities which primarily are companies themselves, and they over the years have realized that they need to have their own facilities in which they can produce, store, and produce and store inventory, or primarily use it as a space to redistribute inventory in a particular region. Now, there are some terms which come across in this, and these terms would be redistribution centers, for example. What is a redistribution center? What is a fulfillment center? And then what we look at is different types. So we look at some of these terms going forward. Now, there is something called an automated warehouse as well. What do you mean by automated warehouse? Wherein we look at the heavy use of computer and robotics technology. We would primarily say that that would be an automated warehouse. Now, let me show you some 2 or 3 very short, interesting videos to differentiate these concepts of, a warehouse. So first, let's look at a short video of, how a warehouse looks like. And for this, I picked up, an Amazon warehouse, because you'll be able to see a lot of things and a lot of different type of functions which we generally get to see when we talk about supply chain logistics, when we talk about warehouses and distribution centers. So here, what I would do is I would look at picking up on the word which is primarily fulfillment. We'll come to that in a second, but look at some of the key words or headlines which come in, and we'll have a quick discussion after you watch the video. So if I stop this here, what were you able to see in this particular video of warehouse?
In this video, we can easily see that the sellers in Amazon has usually shipped their goods to the Amazon own warehouse, in which the workers are usually picking and packing their goods when the orders arrive in their respective listing, and after that the products usually get shipped to their respective delivery addresses.
That's correct. Any observations from you, Sana?
Was the use of automated robots. Whenever an order is placed, they are carrying an entire shelf to the person who's picking up the order item. So that was the most fascinating part for me in the entire video, the usage of those robots, how they know exactly which shelf to carry. And
that's correct. So basically, in this particular video, we see a glimpse of some of the terms that we want to cover. Now, first of all, I will pick up because there are lots of different types of warehouses we will discuss. One of the key things that we look at in the case of Amazon, eBay, there's another company in the UK called Hermes. I will show you a video of that as well. They have different types of warehouses and they classify them into something called fulfillment centers. Now, what are fulfillment centers? These are essentially centers in which you will see incoming orders are received. They are processed. As you could see that when I mean by processing, what you were seeing was there was a guy actually picking up orders or products from the bay, loading it into different trolleys. There was at some point in time packaging being done by by looking at cartons, taping and all, and then at some stage when the box was packed, it was being put onto the conveyor belt, which was essentially shipping. So picking, packing, and shipping. If I put it this way in this order. So what we saw in the fulfillment centers in general, when we talk about a type of a warehouse, you would see that in fulfillment centers, there is these three functions which happen predominantly: picking, packing, and shipping, right? And these are, when we look at this concept of PPS, we basically utilize what is called automation. So you see lots of equipment, miles and miles of conveyor belt, use of technology here. And this is primarily a key characteristic in terms of a particular, fulfillment center or a fulfillment, which is a type of a warehouse. So these are normally warehouses wherein companies are processing end customer orders. These end customer orders are primarily processed in these centers. Some of these centers could be owned by the company. Amazon, for example, owns everything, but they also have third-party centers, which is a term that we use, which is called 3PL, third-party logistics. So they use third-party logistics or centers also to look at managing this as a concept. So rightly picked up. So we looked at one of the concepts of type of warehouses, which is fulfillment center warehouse, which could be owned by the company or it could be a third-party logistics kind of a center. It utilizes automation. They are heavy on automation. They utilize a lot of technology. And the main function in these kind of warehouses or centers is primarily picking, packing, and packaging and service shipping. Is that okay? Yeah. Let's look at an example of another warehouse apart from Amazon. I'm going to try and show you something which is the Hermes So here in short, this is a video of Ocado's warehouse, which is opened, I think recently. It's not probably, maybe a year and a half or so. And they have used automation to the highest level. So there are a few companies in the UK which are primarily looking at, and we'll come to a type of a warehouse wherein you generally see, climate controlled distribution and storage happening. That is also a type of a warehouse. And those are generally related to products wherein you will see either when you're discussing or looking at grocery, we are looking at certain types of articles which have a shelf life. And in those cases, there is a very heavy usage of automation in order to ensure efficient sorting, picking, packaging of products. So this is an example of a warehouse wherein you will see a lot of automation has been used, and pretty much all the servicing in terms of picking, packaging, and shipping to a certain extent is happening with the use of robotics technology, or basically technology. So here we also get to see the use of things like some of the technologies that we heard about, things like barcoding, RFID cards. We look at labeling, for example. When I say labeling, we are talking about barcodes or labeling which allow products to be identified and sorted in a way wherein there are no mistakes which are made. So, and these type of technology that you get to see working within a warehouse is under the Internet of Things that we see. So everything is tracked, all the assets are tracked, they're all labeled with electronic labels or RFIDs, which basically allow automation to come in. And most of this is, to a certain extent, being tracked using telecommunications technology as well. So when we talk about telematics and the use of telematics within an automated warehouse, we are talking about use of different types of technologies. So here, different types of technologies would mean you're using telecommunication, which is say telecom like 4G, 5G technologies. You're looking at vehicular technologies. You're looking at robotics. You're looking at technology which is used to track the delivery of the item going to the customer. So if you have placed an order with Amazon, or you placed an order with, if you have something being delivered by DHL and UPS, you normally get an email which allows you to track where your delivery is, how many miles or kilometers it is away, and when it is going to be delivered. So they are able to give you a pinpoint interval, of a time interval, say within 15 minutes or 30 minutes of a time interval. They are able to give you that as well. And that is all happening using different types of technologies being used in the whole process of, supply chain and logistics. So it might start off in the warehouse, wherein robotics, equipment, RFID, labeling, all that is used. But at some stage, it gets onto the road when the product is being delivered. So you're tracking the truck. You know exactly how many stops it is away from you, or how many customers are being delivered before it comes to you. And that is using the asset tracking and service, which again uses telecommunication like 4G, 5G, cellular networks, and then to a certain extent, obviously internet technology, things like email and updates which are coming to you, and those are all included in the telematics side of things. Now, last video that I want to show you is a video which is primarily of say a sorting, one of the other functions that we want to see. One of the other functions that we want to see within a warehouse, and just watch this short video. We talked about the concept of docking, and you see this Hermes warehouse wherein there are lots of docks which are created. So the material inventory can be brought in, can be shipped out, loaded onto the containers, and then it is shipped out when the trucks ferried across, for onwards to last mile delivery. So this was an example of obviously looking at why docking and docking bays are important, primarily when you look at warehouses. And then one of the last things which I want to show as a example is the concept of sorting, because when we talk about picking, when we talk about packaging, we talk about shipping. Even before this process PPA starts, we need to look into a process called sorting. And this is one of the key functions which happens within a warehouse, because when the material in the inventory or the products, parcels, whatever you call it, are coming into the warehouse, they need to be sorted for arranging deliveries. So you cannot have a parcel, for example, which is originating out of Manchester, wants to go to London. cannot be loaded onto a truck which is going to Midlands, say for example Birmingham, and onwards to London. So if there is a fastest route, if there is a direct delivery and there is enough load, then the sorting would have been done in such a way that there would be one delivery truck or a vehicle which will straight away take it from Manchester to London rather than make stops over in a lot of smaller cities and then go over. So let's look at this function of sorting. So this particular thing that you see is that the scanner knows if this package is going to what city, it is actually dropping it into a particular bay. So there are about 60, 70 bays which are there. And what is happening is that after the machine has sorted the parcel out, it is dropping it into a particular bay, which will then start filling up a particular, container, and that will be going across to one particular city. And there is where the local redistribution of these parcels would happen. So what we see here is falling of the parcels in certain bays, which are as per the city which have been created. Now, have you come across and ever come across this term which is called volumetric weight?
Yes, actually there are two kinds of weight, which is one is actual weight and another one is volumetric weight. When we ship the good from one place to another, then usually two weights are calculated, and the one which is highest, we usually go with that weight. It is the weight which get calculated in terms of CBM in order to ship the goods.
That's correct. So basically, you're looking at the volume of the product, how much space it occupies, and then the physical weight of the product. So volumetric would be length, breadth, height. So when we look at logistics, when we look at inventory management in particular within a warehouse, volumetric weights are very important, is because when shelving capacities are calculated, it is important for the planners when they are looking at some sort of a layout within the warehouse and the shelving is being done. They need to look at knowing both the volumetric weight and the actual weight of the product, so that the shelves can be designed in such a way that they do not collapse. They are able to take the weight, and also optimum loading of inventory. That means different types of packages and different types of inventory can be stored on the shelf. So in order to maximize space or optimize space, as we call it. And the second is to also look at load bearing capacity. When we look at the concept of shelving and inventory storage, it is an important concept that we need to understand that there are two types of weight. So physical weight, which is weight, in terms of kgs and kilograms, and then there is volumetric weight. So with the use of these 3-4 videos, what I've done is basically explained a few key terms which you now know and you have seen it. And the other is we want to look at, different types of warehouses. So we looked at one of the things which, is a fulfillment center. We looked at automated warehouses, and we've looked at, the classification in terms of ownership of warehouses, private, oblique, public, wherein you can lease them for short-term basis if you need excess capacity, and a company might not be looking at building their own warehouse because the need is only time-based. Now, let's briefly look at some of the other types, which is climate-controlled warehouse. Sometimes you see containers on the ships and also on the trucks when logistics or transportation is happening by road, rail, or by air and by sea. You will see that there are climate-controlled, containers. Now, why is climate-controlled warehouses, also required? Is when you look at items like frozen items which are processed. You look at, items which have a perishable life. And some of these items that we talk about would be items like, food products, grocery, you look at flowers, some of the other items which primarily need a dust-free environment. So when we look at sensitive materials, like microprocessor components or telecommunication components, they need dust-free environment. So that is where you would primarily look at climate-controlled warehouses. That means either air conditioning is required or temperature control is required, and that is why you also have these as a different type of a warehouse, which is called climate control. Now we looked at distribution centers. So when we look at distribution centers are different from fulfillment centers. Fulfillment centers are primarily focused on, what are they focused on? Packaging.
Orders, packaging.
Yeah, picking, ordering, packaging, and shipping. Yeah. Distribution centers are primarily responsible for storage of inventory. Here, they are primarily going to be dealing with storage. So that is why it is a distribution center. If a company anticipates there's a lot of demand for a particular product in a particular city, what they would do is they would create a distribution center, and that would primarily look at storing the products. So from that center, the products would be then shipped to either redistribution centers or fulfillment centers, but it is going to be primarily designated as a storage facility. So we've seen some of these videos, and the other videos that I've shown, what I've done is I've put them here in the speaker notes. Now let's look at some of the challenges of warehouse management. Now we understand different types. We understand what is warehousing, concept, management. We look at different types of warehouses, how things move within a warehouse, work within a warehouse. Let's look at some of the challenges. Now, these are things that we've discussed primarily in the first and the second session, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But some of the points that we are able to understand, and they're self-explanatory, is sometimes if you do not plan the warehouse well, poor layout. So storage areas you would see in some corners. When I say poor layout, would be that in some areas there would be more concentration of, say, for example, heavy inventory or materials which are heavy on weight, volumetric weight, and might require more use of equipment. So when we look at layouts, what the key concept here is that when somebody looks at designing a warehouse and the capacity and how the things would flow within the warehouse in terms of equipment, personnel, they would need to look at doing a planning which will allow things to work seamlessly. That means all the equipment can go into the floors. They are able to work freely across the workflows. They do not create any, say, for example, any disturbance in terms of picking. The bay sizes are adequate. The alleys which are created wherein the machinery has to be operated, stored, is adequate. So that is all what refers to the layout. So challenges could be if the warehouse has not been properly planned. That means the bays are quite narrow, the walking spaces are quite narrow, machinery cannot be operated quite well in those, and that would all concentrate and go to poor layout. Now, ineffective storage and transfer of supplies. Sometimes you would see within warehouses goods which are going to move and come in and go out quite quickly would be in one side of the warehouse or closer to docking bays. The reason why this is that in some cases you would see that these goods, because of the serviceability, because of the ordering, because of the frequency at which they are ordered, they are called fast moving goods, and these goods require what is called storage and a mechanism in a place wherein say for example, storage could be flexible. That means it can be expanded, contracted, allows quickly moving in of these goods, and this in some cases could be one of the challenge. Now, ineffective processes. A lot of warehouses, when you look at, they deal with returns. So if you look at the concept of returns, you will generally see that this could be a process which could be a challenge, because when you get returns and if the inventory from returns is not quickly processed or managed to see if this is resellable, it can go back into the inventory, or this is something which needs to be done away with. If it's damaged, it's not labeled correctly. So those would kind of delay picking to happen, delay shipping to happen, and those are because of a process not working within the warehouse. Now, the other thing that we also look at is recurring low or slow periods in supply chain. That means sometimes you would see the whole concept of conveyor belts or automation was brought in, because sometimes you would see workers would wait at their stations for the material to actually be received. And that was either being physically moved by another personnel, or it was being moved by an equipment which was slow to transport the material. So that's why the concept of conveyor belts and automation in terms of robots was brought in, which speeded up the flow of goods within a particular warehouse. And you see this as a concept in airports. When when you check in your luggage, there is miles of conveyor belt underneath the airport. That is what we got to solve on the Amazon warehouse. So conveyor belts are an integral part, and if this has not been planned properly, leading to pays, leading to delivery, leading to, for example, picking up from some places and taking it there. So the idea here is to minimize physical handling of the products. And most of it is, if it is being physically handled, it will be during picking, shipping, or sorting. But or packaging. But apart from that, most of the automation side of things is done in such a way that the materials move, through the warehouse using, technology, and that is one of the challenges. Now, we looked at lean manufacturing, or lean warehousing in the last learning outcome. Now, this concept is applied to, when warehouses are planned. Also because here you do not want to look at creating a facility which is going to be restricted by space. As we looked at in the video, some of the warehousing facilities stretched into, millions of square feet. So when we look at lean warehousing, what we are trying to look at is, we are not trying to restrict how much material can be stored when we are planning the layout of the warehouse. So here what we want to look at doing is, apart from the actual storage which is going to happen, we need to also be looking into things which will allow us to pick, sort, package, and then ship the product. So here the concept of lean warehousing comes in, and the idea here is to eliminate those processes and activities which take a lot of time. So in some cases, when you see if time is going to be used when human is going to be picking, or if you have to travel, because warehouses are quite long, and obviously if you travel on foot, you will generally see that in those cases, those processes are eliminated by the use of lean warehousing, wherein technology is coming in, and wherever we see time being spent, that time is being shaved off by the use of technology, robotics, machinery like carts and golf carts, which are generally used, or those kind of small driving vehicles which are generally used within the warehouse. Now we dip into the principles of lean manufacturing. We talked about the 5 different S, and that allows the warehousing operations to become more efficient and more productive. So the application of lean warehousing into the concept of lean particular, when we talk about lean, nibble, something which is sloping towards, or when we look at this as a clear concept, is done from a point of view doing 2-3 things. One, in order to reduce time, in order to reduce handling, and finally basically looking at any activity which requires a lot of resources. It can be filtered down or bottled down to 1 or 2 resources managing that particular process within the warehouse. So the idea here is to reduce time, reduce handling, and reduce the number of resources required to handle one, to ship that out, or to store it, or pick it, package it, and things like that. So that is the concept of lean warehousing, and that's explained here in the slide is why it is important, because it helps in reducing costs. So when we go back to one triangle that I talk about is service, quality, and time, we look at this triangle being applied in lean warehousing concept as well, because if there is more time going to be taken to pick up an order, package an order, ship an order, that would mean it will add cost to the whole operations. And when we look at adding cost to the operations, this is going to be at the expense of quality, because the customer might not receive the order if the shipping time says 1 or 2 days, but if the customer is going to receive order in 3 or 4 days, that means somewhere, somehow down the line, either the product is being stored in the distribution center, redistribution center, or the fulfillment center. It is taking a bit more time to be able to, than usual, to be delivered across to the customer. So at some stage that will affect quality, because customers might not come back to you and buy that product again. There are other manufacturers, other places which are able to supply it in shorter duration and time, and that would affect, your costs in the long term, and that is where quality comes in. So when we look at, these are some of the benefits which are, derived by following the principles of lean management when we look at planning warehousing. So this is called lean warehousing. Now, some of the areas where it focuses on is focused on the 5S principles of lean. So you look at an operating system, you look at managing infrastructure, and you look at managing mindset and behaviors. So you look at human resources in this particular, people who are involved in at some stage you cannot do away with all the automation, cannot do away with the intervention of humans. So at some stage people will be required to work and handle these products within the warehouse. But in order to look at ensuring that they are all tuned in to this concept, we divide it into 3 or 4 areas. So one is the operating system. That means when the planning is being done, you look at bringing in automation technology resources in such a way that they are optimally placed to ensure efficiency and productivity within a warehouse. The management side of things is primarily looking at policies and procedures which are put in place. What happens when? Is this going to come before this, or is this going to come after that? So when I looked at putting this on picking, packaging, shipping, it cannot be packaging first, then picking, and then shipping. It can actually happen if multiple products are being ordered by a customer. Then what will happen is picking will happen, some part of packaging will happen, but overall packaging can also be done, because if one customer during the Christmas has ordered, say, 5 items and it's been picked by 5 different people coming from 5 different locations, you will still see what Amazon would do is not ship them out as one packet for 5 different items, but they will ship it out as one box, all the 5 items within that box. So packaging and picking as a process can, overlap, but at some stage they all fall into this routine of, process-wise, picking happens always first, then the packaging happens, and then finally shipping happens. And that would be the management side of things. Now, this is an example, of a lean warehousing model that you see, which typically gets implemented in a warehouse. So there are various components of it. When we see, for example, supplier management, which is the procurement of goods. So if you recall the functions that we generally saw in this slide, when we talked about the evolution, of logistics here. So all these functions are primarily grouped, into some parts of it. So when we see procurement, production control, we look at, retailing, pricing, and labeling. We look at some part of it from a point of view of, customer relationship management, which is front facing. So you look at planning, sales, forecasting, customer service, and then in the background, when you look at dealing with production or how goods are coming in, you're looking at, dealing with suppliers, factories, production facilities, and that is where you look at, flow of goods coming into the warehouse and going out of your facility to the customer for delivery. So all this is an example of how, what comes first, what comes second, how it, it falls into a process, and what side of things are facilitated by, customer demand, what side of things are facilitated by equipment, automation, the concepts that we talk about, which is primarily, supply chain, logistics, and transportation, and then what components of this is enabled by, technology. So you see this whole principles that we talk about, the 5S being applied, and that is how a snapshot of warehouse planning would look like if a warehouse has been planned using the concept of, lean in particular, or lean warehousing in particular. So any questions on this so far? Okay, let's look at briefly the problems in warehousing. Now, a lot of companies make large, facilities which are warehouse. What could be the problems that you can think of can come in warehouse?
The goods would be missing, mishandling.
Correct. So one of the key things, if I just look at I'm just trying to visualize a warehouse, and if I give you a different perspective, would be there are some products which can get lost in the warehouse. Some products which are not being serviced and they've been on the shelf for a number of months or weeks or days. They are not moving. So some of the problems in warehousing would be wrong forecasting has been done, wrong calculation of inventory has been done, and that inventory is not moving and is sitting on the warehouse, which is primarily costing the company a lot of money because one, it is not getting sold. Second, it is using vital shelf space. So can you think of some of these type of problems, that you generally see in the warehouse?
Yes.
Any ideas on this? So,
Actually,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, recently only in our company we faced this issue that we forecasted a lot and piled up our warehouses, and choking has occurred, and now we can't find the goods which are actually selling because the stock is piled up over there.
Can't find the goods, damage, of goods or inventory, So, for example, somebody has dropped certain items and it's broken. You see a lot of this happening when we look at insurance, which companies take out, which are warehousing companies. They have a certain fixed financial cost which is attributed towards insurance because typically in a warehouse in a year there is a certain amount of insurance cost or 1 to 2% of the turnover is actually attributed towards insurance cost because TV while being taken out has fallen, broken, a lot of pressure has been applied. So a lot of testing typically goes on when the warehouse is made functional is because a lot of machine and equipment needs to be tuned to handle some of these products. So generally, if I look at, I've been to one or two warehouses on the visits, and what I've looked at is there are places in the warehouse wherein you will see dust accumulating, the goods have not moved, the material has been quarantined. As we say, this is not for use, it's shipping back to the supplier because it's not moving. Some of the things is sometimes, as you mentioned, Sana, that you can't find goods. Even after labeling, even after having all the technology, sometimes it is very difficult to find goods because the goods either have dropped below a certain inventory and the system has stopped tracking. So if it's gone to a single digit, you don't know where it is stored. Sometimes it is damage to the inventory, and sometimes you will also see that because of the perishable life of the goods, if they are not shipped out and it is not tracked by somebody who's managing that, you will generally see that all that has to go to the landfill or, has to be dumped. And that is a cost that they have to write off because it's not been properly, managed. So when we look at some of these things, these are all problems that we can structure into some of the problems that I've highlighted on these slides. So when I talk about redundant process, this could be an example wherein the goods have not been tracked by the planners within the warehouse. And what has happened is it's got a perishable life, and that would mean the goods have now to be, made, go to the landfill, or they have to be binned because they no longer have a shelf life they can be used. Poor facility layout, you've given an example, sometimes damage to the inventory, you can't find goods. That basically would be one of the problems that you see in the warehouse. Seasonality in demand would be overstocking. Stocks not moving, which you were also mentioned, and in some cases, they would also mean that these goods are then quarantined and they should go back to the supplier because a lot of these companies now have open credit lines, and when they have open credit lines, they negotiate that if it's not sold during seasons of say for example, when we look at Cyber Monday, we look at Thanksgiving sale, we look at Christmas, we look at some of the other days when a lot of these sale activities happen, a lot of suppliers and manufacturers push a lot of inventory out to these companies to say, okay, no, there's going to be a demand, this is what we forecasted, so you should stock this. But at some stage, what they do is the management, the buyers, the purchase managers also have a clause that if it's not sold within so many days, we'll ship the inventory back to you. So that is to look at seasonality in demand, and because warehousing space at some stage contributes to cost, what they want to look at is minimizing those costs, and that is where seasonality of demand would also be one of the problems which warehousing companies could face. Inaccurate inventory would mean, again, obsolete inventory, inventory buildups. It could be you ordered something but something else has arrived, which is inaccurate. Labor costs, easy to explain. So if you're picking up a lot of goods and these goods are being picked up wrong, then the cost is that the person has to spend again the same amount of time to take that good back into the shelf and then pick out something which was actually required. So a lot of training goes into warehouse, in particular in the personnel in the warehouse working who pick up orders, to ensure that they are able to understand the coding, the RFID codes, the barcodes, and in general, they have to familiarize themselves with where the goods are stored within the warehouse. So they need to know the bays or the alleys and the equipment required to use and pick that product out, which basically helps in reducing some costs or operational costs in the long term if they are able to pick goods first time correct. Product identification. You look at Amazon, it was talking about, 6.5 million types of goods being stored in the fulfillment center. And if the identification goes wrong, that means incorrect labels, barcodes are not applied correctly, then that would mean a chaos or a havoc. That means a lot of different goods would go to customers if the barcoding mistakes are to happen or the labeling mistakes are to happen. You receive something which you have not ordered. And in those cases, there is a cost involved for getting it back, asking the customer to return, customer service, apologies, lots of other things which need to be then looked into. Customer service is one such example wherein, again, these could be issues in general with, logistics, not in particular with warehousing, but these could be issues with logistics in particular, because if the good is not shipped on time, if the customer has not received the good, this could lead to cases where, I've ordered this, but I've not got, but the logistics guy would have delivered the good across to the next door neighbor. So what most companies now do is, if you're not at home, they send you a text message that your good is on delivery, or they send you an email, and if you're not able to collect, should we drop it at your, arrange an alternate time, drop it to your neighbors, or leave it somewhere. So these kind of things have now been built in, into the logistics operation side of things, because if you go and you are not able to deliver, again, that will have to mean it's a wasted trip, and some delivery vehicle or the courier will have to go again and try and look at delivering that good to the customer. That adds to all types of costs. So fuel cost is one such cost which gets added on. Now, imagine if this good is not delivered on first go and on the second go, then the company does not make another effort to deliver the good, but what they do is they drop a card to your door, through your letterbox, to say, we've made a number of attempts to deliver this good, but we've not been successful. So what now is going to happen is the good is going to be stored in the redistribution center, from which you can come and collect, and it will be stored for about 30 days. If you do not collect in 30 days, it goes back to the company as order not being fulfilled. So all this adds to, costs, but these are costs primarily on the logistics side, which is, when I say logistics, means transportation and storage side rather than on warehousing side. Is that okay?
Yes.
So when we look at some of the, solutions, now getting into what I've discussed earlier is technology being, applied, is where, manufacturers are now using, intermediary suppliers, third-party logistics companies. If it's an order, for example, which has been ordered by a customer wherein there is no local distribution center, or, for example, a storage facility, in those cases, companies, what they would do is they would charge a service for delivery. So normal orders in Amazon, for example, would typically be free of cost. If you've reached a certain value, say of £20 in the UK, then orders are delivered free. If you want Prime delivery, that means you want next day delivery. There is a service called Prime in Amazon. Now, in some cases, you would see that if there are orders being received from customers which are in, remote locations, which require a lot of transportation, in those cases, what will happen is generally you would see the company charging certain distribution costs or courier costs, delivery costs, as I would say. And that would require an outsourcing to third party happening, because the company would not go out of the way primarily to service that order. So they will pass it to a third party logistics courier and incur the cost, which is charged indirectly to the customer. And that is how the product gets then delivered. But in between this delivery happening, there's a bit of use of technology, and that is when we look at this. So, for example, there's a tracking of asset being done. You can see where the delivery chain, where is the delivery in the chain in terms of transportation. You're also looking at, and this is possible because there is item level tracking happening, because the barcoding or the use of RFIDs and things like that allows the tracking to happen on the product, because the product is maybe using different types of technologies. So when it leaves the warehouse, you get a message or an email that it is now being shipped out or it's left the warehouse. And then when it is, say, about 10 stops away, you start getting text messages or updates on the email. It's 5 stops away, 3 stops away, or should be delivered within this and this time. So they use different types of technologies. And here, a lot of companies have now come in primarily who provide these, technologies, and they are all related to what is called the Internet of Things. So I've mentioned some definitions of these in the speaker notes here for you to understand. And this is now a clear part of all warehousing and logistics operations anywhere in the world, wherever it can be safely deployed, because this helps in reducing cost or operational costs. And this is primarily because it helps save time. Now, the last learning outcome that we want to understand in this is how do we look at the importance of logistics to warehousing. So we have concentrated in the first two parts on warehousing in particular. But what is the involvement of logistics, or say transportation side of things, to warehousing? So let's link it up together. So when you look at redistribution centers, we look at fulfillment centers, we look at storage centers or warehouses as we call them, we generally see that all the inventory storage happens in a distribution center. From there, the onwards delivery to a fulfillment center or to a redistribution center is primarily done on the basis of orders being received from customers. And that is where we start to look at the function of logistics to come in. So when I say when the functions of logistics, what do I mean by functions of logistics is that there is some sort of a complex operation which will get into underway, which is, say, when I say complex operation, a series of activities which would primarily be related to picking up the product and then putting it onto say some sort of a transport, and that transport, whether it's rail, sea, freight, air, would actually then be looking at taking it to a destination where at some stage in that destination, that will then be finally going on to the customer. So when we look at the operations of or activities of logistics, we divide them into two parts: physical supply chain or management of material, which is coming from the source or the manufacturer to a distribution center or a storage warehouse, and then onwards from that after being processed. So processing here would mean picking, packaging, and shipping onwards onto some sort of a transport and then going to the customer. And that physical distribution would then constitute, the logistics side of things. So physical management of goods and the distribution, which is last mile delivery to the customer, would all comprise of the process of something called logistics. And here you would see these kind of things happening: transportation, inventory maintenance, order processing, in some cases acquisition, which is part of the supply chain, or different parts coming from the different manufacturers in the supply chain, and then being integrated into a final product, packaging happening, warehousing, which is storage, and then some sort of picking, processing happening to put that material onto, transportation. And at some stage, when it is physical transportation, it is physical transportation. Then the concept of volumetric weight. So which city, how many trucks, what packages, what size, and then what orders. So all those things then come into the transportation side of things. Now, reasons of importance of logistics. Can you think of any reasons why logistics is important when we link it up to warehousing? Any reasons that you can think of if you visualize a warehouse and you look at why logistics comes in, or where logistics starts getting integrated into the warehouse?
So that the goods get delivered to the end customer in a more organized and in a more timely way.
Correct. Anything else that you can think of? So here, what I would suggest is when I look at, say, just visualizing a warehouse in my mind, what I generally see from the videos that we saw was, when I talk about logistics, I saw and I talked about things like, lots of trucks, because we saw only a distribution center or a fulfillment center. We saw a lot of trucks moving in and moving out, a lot of docking bays, and that kind of reminds me or puts me and links me up to what is logistics. So I think of transportation in a particular way. The other thing which I also look at is when I look at the organization of how the inventory is being loaded or taken out from the trucks or the containers. I then also think of packages, different types. I visualize different boxes, different packages. So again, it is to look at sorting as a function. So when we look at when I talk about logistics, I can only look at visualizing a couple of words which come, and the things that I've seen. It relates to trucks, containers, storage, boxes, pallets, those kind of things, forklift equipment. They are all coming to my mind. So when I look at logistics, I'm looking at things which will help me do a bit of transportation. So if you're retrieving goods from the shelf, you're using forklifts, cranes, or lifts. When you are putting it into a container at the back of a truck for shipping it, again, we think of, these kind of equipments, and they are looking at helping you load or unload material. But that loading, unloading of material, if I look at sea freight, it's happening on ships, in containers. When I look at rail transport, again, happening on wagons and other bits. When I think of aircrafts, again, we see trolleys and lifts and, those kind of things like conveyor belts, where in the last mile, then it is being shipped to the aircraft and it's being loaded into the ship. When I look at road transport, I look at, visualizing trucks. So when we look at all this, the importance of logistics is basically the last mile connectivity, which is delivery to customer, what you said, Hamza. But that all involves the process of, transportation. So here, the idea would be to try and look at how logistics helps once the order is picked, packaged, and the last mile thing which is being done, which is shipped, is basically, shipped to the customer. When I look at, is basically logistics. So even a factory could have a customer, which is, we are producing something, but that factory is supplying to another factory. For them, they are a customer. The factory is again then finishing some part of the product and supplying it to a distribution center. Again, that is a customer for them. But onwards from distribution center, when it is loaded onto a truck and it is going to the customer, which is the end customer, would be the process of, logistics. So logistics is quite important, because when you look at loading and unloading of goods from warehouse, the creation of bays, the creation of the sorting systems in particular, are done in order to shave off costs on the logistics side. So at some stage, packing, picking is all happening within the warehouse. But the last mile, which is to sort it out and then ship it to the right way so that it then can be transported, is where logistics becomes important in warehousing. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good stuff. So I think with this, we pretty much looked at covering learning outcome 3. Any questions on this so far? Yeah. So we should be able to then look at, addressing some of the tasks on learning outcome 3. And what I will do is I will put this copy of the presentation up on Moodle just after the session. And if you have any questions, you can ask me via email, but we'll catch up next week to start, the learning outcome 4. Now, some of you, so is that okay?
Yes.
I'll close this session here.